You were never meant to hear this. Not here, not now, not while the world still pretends that the past is safely buried. But the past was never buried, it was hidden. And the place I'm about to take you, it's not just a story, it's a wound, covered by cement, painted over with bright colors, and dressed up to look like innocence. Imagine this, the sound of children laughing in a schoolyard, bouncing balls against brick walls, their voices rising with life, and beneath their feet, bones, rows upon rows of nameless skeletons, stacked in silence, their mouths locked forever in screams that no one living was supposed to hear. This isn't rumor, this isn't ghost story. It happened. The graveyard beneath the school is real. Workers discovered it by accident, their shovels striking bone instead of soil, coffins instead of clay, and in that moment, the illusion cracked. What was supposed to stay forgotten surfaced like a corpse through shallow water. But let me warn you, this discovery is not just about a graveyard. The ground beneath that school is a doorway, and every doorway has keepers. You see, history is full of places that governments, churches, and institutions would rather you never see, not because the dead are dangerous, but because the truth buried with them could unmake the story of who we are. The children who played on that ground were walking on top of secrets older than their families, older than the nation itself. Bones that weren't meant to rest, they were meant to be erased. Someone built a school above that graveyard for a reason. To cover, to silence, to keep generations blind to what happened before them. And that should raise a question in you right now. If they built classrooms on top of coffins, what else have they built on top of lies? Stay with me, because this story doesn't stop at a graveyard. It pulls you into something darker, something we were trained to never look at. A history hidden in plain sight. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is your warning. What follows is dangerous. The discovery began like a mistake. A maintenance crew was digging near the schoolyard, just another routine job. They thought they'd hit tree roots, thick and unyielding, but when the soil broke, when the earth gave way, it wasn't wood that surfaced. It was a femur, smooth, white, human. At first they laughed it off, a prank maybe, or the remnants of some forgotten anatomy class. But then came the second bone, and the third. Then, entire skeletons. Dozens. Then hundreds. You see, graveyards are supposed to be sacred. Resting places marked, catalogued, honored. But this one was different. No records, no headstones, no official history to explain why hundreds of bodies were crammed beneath the ground. The city archives didn't list a cemetery at that location. The school board denied any knowledge. The church remained silent. This silence was the first clue. Because when history vanishes from the record, it is rarely an accident. Erasure is deliberate. And ask yourself, who benefits from building over bones, from teaching multiplication tables where prayers for the dead once rose? Who gains when the truth is paved under playground asphalt? Here's what we know. This was not the only graveyard turned into something else. Across America and across the world, lands soaked in tragedy were recycled, rebranded, repurposed. Plantation burial grounds turned into shopping centers, asylums paved over with parking lots, entire towns submerged beneath reservoirs, the living rearranging the dead to suit their own illusions of progress. But why here? Why beneath this particular school? That is where the trail of bones leads us. Because once you dig deep enough, you learn the most chilling truth. The bodies buried under this school were not just victims of time, they were victims of something else. Listen carefully. When skeletons are found with broken skulls, shattered ribs, dead spines, it means violence. When coffins are too small, stacked with tiny bones, it means children. And when no one in authority will speak of it, it means cover-up. So let me say it clearly. This wasn't just a forgotten graveyard. It was an execution ground, a place where the unwanted were hidden, a place where the living walked away, and the dead were sealed beneath stone and silence. And now you know why the discovery had to be buried all over again, because once the truth surfaces, it does more than reveal the past. It exposes the system that thrives on forgetting. The question that haunted the discovery was simple. Who were they? Bones do not lie. They tell stories even when every book and ledger has been scrubbed clean. Forensic teams brought in to examine the remains noticed something immediately. Many of the skeletons were small, too small. They were children, infants, teenagers, dozens of them stacked beneath the soil like discarded furniture, and mixed among them were the elderly. Brittle bones, arthritic joints, bodies frail from disease or neglect. This was no ordinary cemetery. Cemeteries honor their dead. This was a dumping ground. And if you know the machinery of history, you already sense the truth. These were the forgotten, orphans, the poor, the sick, the enslaved, the institutionalized, the kind of people that governments, churches, and ruling elites have always tried to erase, the kind of people who did not fit the vision of progress, so they were silenced. Official records from the town offered only vague references: a poorhouse, an infirmary, a colored orphan asylum. Words meant to sanitize suffering, but the bones beneath the school tell a darker tale. Broken limbs that never healed, skulls caved in not by accident, but by force, children's teeth ground down by malnutrition, signs of systematic neglect. And then, there was something worse. Among the remains, some coffins bore markings, strange symbols carved into wood, crosses bent out of shape, circles with intersecting lines, marks that did not match any religious burial tradition. Scholars whispered that these were signs of ritual, that the bodies were not only buried but used. This is where the silence becomes deafening, because when evidence of ritual emerges in history, the institutions responsible always look away. They blame ignorance, superstition, accident, but if you trace the patterns, you'll find the same signs across forgotten graveyards in cities and towns you know by name. The school above this graveyard was not an accident. It was camouflage. Children laughing, bells ringing, teachers scolding, all of it designed to cover the sound of the ground itself, groaning beneath their feet. You weren't supposed to know this. You weren't supposed to ask who those children were, why they were left beneath dirt instead of memory. But the truth is bleeding through now. And if you've followed me this far, you already feel it, the pull of something ancient and forbidden, reaching out from beneath that schoolyard, demanding to be seen. Graveyards don't erase themselves. Records don't vanish on their own. Silence always has architects. When the bones beneath the school first surfaced, the local government issued its response in a single word: mistake. They claimed the site had once been an informal burial ground, nothing more than a footnote of history. But here's what they didn't say: no such burial ground was listed in any municipal record. No permits, no markers, nothing. It was as if the dead had been invisible even when they were alive. And when the press tried to cover the story, their headlines evaporated within days. Reporters told of pressure from above, calls from city officials, veiled warnings, sudden reassignments. Even the archives where old maps were stored mysteriously lost their files. Who has the power to erase history in real time? Schools are run by boards. Boards are influenced by churches. Churches are shielded by governments. And governments, well, they answer to something higher, something most people never see. The graveyard beneath this school is not just a site of death, it is a mirror, a reflection of how institutions work together, not to protect truth, but to protect themselves. Consider this: churches sanctify ground. If this had been a legitimate cemetery, there would be parish records, sermons, blessings. None exist, which means one of two things. Either the church sanctioned these burials in secret, or they knew and chose to look away. Both options point to complicity. The government, for its part, seized control of the land long ago. Land deeds show the property changing hands rapidly in the 19th century, moving through shell companies before ending up under public use. Every transfer designed to blur the paper trail. Why such precision if the land was worthless, and the school itself, built directly above the dead? Ask yourself, why here, when land stretch for miles around? Why construct classrooms over bones, unless the very act of covering was part of the plan? The answer is as chilling as it is simple. Institutions bury the dead to bury the truth, because truth is dangerous. It threatens order, it disrupts obedience, And the last thing they want is for you to remember that beneath every monument to progress lies a foundation of bones. The graveyard was not forgotten, it was silenced. And the silence was bought, signed and sealed by the very powers that claim to protect you. Schools are supposed to be places of learning, places where innocence is preserved, where young minds are shaped into futures. But what if that shaping is not about knowledge, but about control? Think about it. A school built directly on top of a graveyard. Children running in circles, laughing, playing, never knowing they are dancing above coffins. Every day they walked across that ground, unknowingly rehearsing the ritual of forgetting. Generations of children trained to ignore what lies beneath the surface. That is the first lesson of control. Teach people not to see what is directly under their feet. Education is not neutral. It has never been. The curriculum taught in those classrooms did not tell students about the graveyard below. It didn't tell them about the poorhouse, the asylum, or the children who starved and were buried in shallow soil. Instead, they were taught patriotic songs, neat arithmetic, fairy tale history. They were taught obedience dressed up as knowledge. You see, the placement of the school was not random. It was symbolic. It was psychological. The bones became foundation stones, not for learning, but for forgetting. And this is the pattern. Across the world, schools, churches, and government halls are often built on ground where the silenced sleep. Indian boarding schools built over burial grounds, orphanages hiding graves in their gardens, institutions rising above the very people they destroyed. It is more than coincidence. It is design, a macabre form of architecture that says, we own not only your life, but your death. We decide where you rest. We decide whether you are remembered or erased. And for the children inside those classrooms, they were breathing in the silence. Every chalkboard lesson, every pledge recited, every test taken was another brick in a wall that kept the truth sealed below. Without ever knowing it, they became part of the cover-up. But here's what they don't tell you. The dead are not silent. They press upward, they leak into the dreams of the living, they haunt the corridors in whispers too soft for teachers to write down. And sometimes, a child would go home from that school with eyes wide and afraid, saying they felt something watching, something cold rising from the floor. And that is how control works. Not by denying the truth, but by building on top of it until generations forget it was ever there. This school is not an anomaly. It is a blueprint. Look across the map of history and you'll see the same story repeated, hidden in plain sight. Cemeteries turned into highways, burial mounds flattened for shopping malls, asylums erased, their patients' graves paved into parking lots. Each time, the same justification. Progress, expansion, civilization moving forward. But progress built on corpses is not progress, it is conquest. Take the boarding schools for indigenous children across North America. Officially, they were educational institutions. In truth, they were reprogramming factories. Children were stripped of their language, their culture, their spirit, and when they died, as so many did, they were buried in secret graves beneath the very schools meant to erase them. Thousands of children still lie there, their names unmarked, their families never told. Or consider the paupers' graves beneath major cities, entire blocks built over the poor, their bones disturbed to make way for skyscrapers and subway tunnels. No plaques, no monuments, just silence, covered by commerce. And then, there are the hospitals, the orphanages, the asylums, institutions meant to heal, to shelter, to protect. But whose forgotten burial grounds tell another story, stories of abuse, neglect, and systematic disposal of those deemed unfit, places where the vulnerable entered alive and exited as silence. Do you see the pattern yet? The living bury the unwanted, and then the powerful bury the memory. Institutions rise not beside graveyards, but on top of them. It is not just convenience, it is symbolism. It is domination. A message carved into the landscape itself. We decide who matters, we decide who is remembered, we decide who can be erased. The school above that graveyard was not merely hiding bones. It was part of an ancient practice of recycling death into obedience. The children, Inside those walls we're being conditioned to sit calmly on top of atrocity, to breathe air heavy with secrets, to learn without questioning. And that is the deeper horror. This is not just about the past. It is about training the present, about shaping the minds of the next generation to accept what lies beneath, as if silence were natural, as if forgetting were a virtue. The graveyard beneath that school is a scar, but the scar is not just in the earth, it is in us. You can bury bones, you can silence records, you can even erase names from ledgers, but memory leaks. No institution, no matter how powerful, can contain the pressure of the forgotten forever. The dead always push back, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, and when the graveyard beneath the school was covered, it became a pressure cooker, secrets compressed under brick and concrete, waiting for release. The release came in whispers. Teachers reported strange drafts in sealed classrooms, cold patches where no window was open, no vent connected. Children would draw pictures of figures standing in the playground, watching them, figures the teachers never saw, and in the silence between lessons, footsteps would echo in empty hallways. But it wasn't only haunting in the ghost story sense, it was haunting in the psychological sense. Generations raised on that ground carried something with them, a weight, a silence passed down like an inheritance, because whether they knew it or not, they were shaped by the buried. They were living on a lie, and lies leave cracks in the soul. You see, suppression does not erase, it festers, and suppressed history manifests in ways that the living cannot always explain. Nightmares that recur for decades, anxiety that clings without cause, an entire community growing up restless, suspicious, fragmented, because beneath them was trauma that had never been named. And here's the darker truth. Institutions know this. They count on it. They understand that haunted ground makes haunted people, and haunted people are easier to control. When you are restless but cannot explain why, when you carry pain but do not know its source, you are less likely to rebel. You turn inward, blaming yourself, instead of looking outward at the system. This is why the forgotten graveyard matters. Not only because of the bones, not only because of the cover up, but because the forgetting itself becomes a tool of control. The children buried there were silenced once, and then their silence was weaponized, turned into a shadow that still hangs over the living. The haunting is not just ghosts. The haunting is obedience. And if you've ever felt it, that unease in familiar places, that sense that something was wrong long before you arrived, now you know why. The ground remembers, even when the textbooks do not. When investigators unearthed the first intact coffins, they expected decay, rot, silence. What they found instead was something else, something that doesn't belong in an ordinary grave. The wood was marked, not with names, not with prayers, not with crosses in their true form, but with symbols, carved deep, circles intersected with lines, spirals that twisted inward, crosses bent out of shape as if mocking the sacred. At first they dismissed it as graffiti, random marks left by careless hands, but patterns do not lie. The same symbols appeared again and again. And if you know how to read the language of power, you already recognize what this means. These were not just burials, they were rituals. History leaves a trail of symbols for those who care to look. You find them on ancient altars, in the margins of medieval texts, etched into the stones of forgotten churches. And now, in the coffins beneath the schoolyard, the same crooked signs appearing across centuries, across continents. But what do they mean? Scholars debate. Some call them protective wards, a desperate attempt by grieving hands to shield the dead. Others whisper of darker purposes, seals, meant not to protect the dead, but to bind them, to trap them, to hold their silence in place so it would never rise again. Think about that. It wasn't enough to bury these children. They had to be sealed, locked in with signs that reach back into traditions older than the nation itself, traditions whispered about in secret societies, passed down in hidden rites. And here is the most disturbing part. Those who carved the symbols knew they would be buried out of sight. They were not decoration. They were instruction, orders left for the earth itself. Ask yourself, who would perform such a ritual? Church authorities? Secret fraternities? The very institutions sworn to protect the innocent? Or are those categories not as separate as we've been taught? The bones beneath the school were not just forgotten, they were used as vessels in a system of power that feeds on silence, that feeds on erasure, that feeds on obedience. You were never meant to see those markings, you were never meant to ask what they meant, but now you have. And once you ask, you step into a lineage of seekers who were always warned to turn back. Symbols carved into coffins are not relics of the past, they echo into the present, and if you look closely you will see them everywhere. On government buildings, in the architecture of schools, in the crests of institutions that claim to serve the public. They are not decorative, they are language of control, language meant to condition. When you walk into a city hall, a courthouse, or even your local library, pay attention. Notice the spirals in the tilework, the circles that overlap like eyes watching from above, the subtle crosses skewed out of shape. Most people walk past unaware. But those symbols are reminders of a deeper lineage, of power that survives by embedding itself in everyday life. And it is not coincidence that the same patterns appear above classrooms as appeared on the coffins. They are instructions, whispering, obedience, silence, compliance. You sit, you learn, you do not question. You play on top of graves and never see them. And the system smiles. Because every repetition strengthens the chain, every generation trained to accept the unseen becomes easier to govern. History is repeating itself, right under our noses. The dead beneath the school were sealed with symbols for a reason. The living above are sealed in the same way, psychologically, socially, institutionally. Every brick, every beam, every lesson is part of the architecture of obedience. And when you notice it, the unease begins to rise. That gut feeling of wrongness, that whisper at the edge of perception, that is the system telling you, you are beginning to remember. The power of the forgotten is not gone. It lives in shadows, in hidden rituals, in symbols that continue to shape behavior without consent. Institutions have always known this. Control is not only about what you can see, but what you cannot see, what you are trained to ignore. And now you are seeing it. You feel it. The unease crawling up your spine is the first step toward understanding, because awareness is dangerous, and power, true forbidden power, is always afraid of those who awaken to it. You may think this is over, that the past is beneath your feet, but history never sleeps. The dead beneath the school are only the beginning. They are the key to understanding how the system operates, quietly, invisibly, and always for the benefit of those who know how to wield it. You cannot walk on the dead without feeling it, whether you know it or not. Generations raised above hidden graves inherit more than land. They inherit tension, unease, and patterns of compliance that no one taught them. Psychologists call it intergenerational trauma. I call it the whisper of the forgotten, pressed into the bones of the living. Children growing up on that schoolyard carried an invisible burden. Restless nights, unexplained anxiety, a nagging sense that something was wrong with the world, but no words to name it. They were absorbing the echoes of those silenced beneath them. This is subtle, not violent, but effective. The power of the buried dead is quiet. You see it in students who learn to follow rules without question, in communities that accept injustice as normal, in adults who never rebel against authority because obedience has been coded into their subconscious long before they understood it. The school was an incubator of this effect. Every lesson, every rule, every laugh on the playground was layered over the skeletons of the forgotten, and every layer reinforced the lie. Life is orderly, authority is just, history is safe. All the while, beneath the cement and grass, the truth waited, pressing upward. And when the truth rises, it comes as discomfort first. Irritation, unease, faint memories that don't belong to you, dreams that don't make sense, symbols repeating in your environment, unnoticed, shaping decisions, choices, loyalties. The living inherit the dead's silence, and the system uses it. Some will feel the weight and ignore it. Others will feel it and act unconsciously, lashing out, protecting or hiding truths themselves. Few will ask, why do I feel this? Why does obedience come naturally to me? Why does injustice feel normal? If you are listening to this, you are already asking. That is dangerous. That is awakening. Because once you name the invisible weight, you begin to resist it. Once you notice the chains, you begin to see the locksmiths. And that is exactly what those who built over graveyards feared. Not your obedience, but your awareness. Awareness spreads, awareness questions, awareness remembers. And memory is the one weapon that even the dead cannot take from you. Silence does not happen by accident. Forgetting does not occur naturally. It is manufactured. And the graveyard beneath that school was not simply buried. It was erased with precision, strategy, and intent. The first layer of the cover-up was paperwork. Land deeds were altered, maps misfiled, and permits conveniently lost. If anyone searched for evidence of a cemetery, they found nothing. City planners, historians, and journalists ran into walls of bureaucracy designed to frustrate inquiry. Dead ends were intentional. Disbelief was cultivated. The second layer was social conditioning. Teachers were instructed to redirect questions, to maintain cheerful decorum, to repeat approved narratives. Parents were told the schoolyard was safe, bright, and modern. Children were never told the history beneath their feet. They learned civics, math, and art, but not the truth. They were taught silence, and that silence became second nature. The third layer was fear, subtle, insidious. Whispers of, "You shouldn't ask," and "some things are better left alone." People who pressed too hard disappeared from records or were reassigned. Some were publicly discredited. The system ensured that those who stumbled upon the truth, archivists, archaeologists, or local historians, understood the cost of persistence. The final layer was normalization. The graveyard ceased to exist in public consciousness. Playgrounds were painted over the soil. Cafeterias were built. Sports fields replaced sacred ground. The past was literally paved over, made invisible to every eye except the one that refused to forget. And here is the critical insight. Cover-up is not just about hiding evidence. It is about controlling perception. Once the story is gone from memory, once the land seems ordinary, authority can operate without question. The buried dead become a metaphor, an instrument of psychological control, a lesson that power writes history, not truth. Every institution has applied this model somewhere. Churches that whitewash scandals, governments that erase inconvenient events, corporations that reshape narratives to protect wealth and influence. And now you see it in microcosm, a school built on bones, silenced through bureaucracy, conditioning, fear, and normalization. The lesson is clear. Cover-up is never messy. It is deliberate, it is layered, it is precise, and those who understand its mechanisms hold the ability to manipulate generations. The graveyard beneath the school was not just hidden, it was weaponized. Every graveyard erased has its architects. Every secret buried carries fingerprints, and the bones beneath that school were no exception. Historical records, pieced together from fragmented maps, obscure ledgers, and whispered accounts, point to a network that spans city halls, churches, and private foundations. Wealthy benefactors, masked as philanthropists, purchased the land in the late 1800s. Their intention was clear: transform a burial ground into a site that would serve the living while erasing the dead. The local school board was complicit, though likely not fully aware of the history. They were instruments, not originators. Their role was simple: build the institution, maintain the narrative, and ensure children walked safely over graves without ever knowing. But the deeper players operated in shadows. Secret societies with roots in Masonic, religious, and fraternal orders had long-standing practices of managing death, memory, and obedience. They understood that controlling what the living remember or forget was far more powerful than any law or army. Symbols carved into coffins, financial maneuvers, and social conditioning all bear the hallmarks of these hidden hands. And here is the unnerving truth. These networks still exist. They evolve, but the principle remains the same: control memory, control perception, control life. And by doing so, they maintain dominance over generations who think they are free. The school, in this sense, is a monument, not to education, but to control. Every wall, every desk, every playground swing is part of a centuries-old pattern. Those who constructed it were playing a long game. They understood that by shaping the environment of youth, by embedding power in architecture and narrative, they could manipulate generations without firing a single shot. The bodies beneath were inconvenient witnesses. They had to be hidden, the truth had to be masked, and the children above, innocent, unaware, became both shield and audience. They walked over history, laughing, ignorant and perfectly conditioned to accept the world as told to them. Ask yourself this: if you discovered a graveyard beneath your own school, who would have allowed it to happen? Who would have known and done nothing? And who would profit from that silence? The answers are not comforting. They lie in systems that value obedience over truth, perception over justice, and memory over morality. The architects are invisible, but their influence is unmistakable. And now that you know, you begin to see the outlines of the machinery that shapes reality itself. The school above the graveyard is not a modern anomaly. It is a continuation of a practice as old as civilization itself. Across continents and centuries, civilizations have built over the dead to control the living. The bones of the past have always been tools in the hands of power. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers buried enemies beneath city walls, ensuring that the land itself carried both the memory of conquest and the weight of obedience. In medieval Europe, churches were often built atop pagan burial grounds, converting sacred spaces to serve new authorities. And in colonial America, poorhouses and orphanages were carefully sited over cemeteries, repurposing both land and silence. The lesson is unmistakable: control the dead, control the living. Every generation reinforced this logic. Every institution learned that burying inconvenient truths beneath structures of authority creates obedience not through force, but through inheritance. The symbols carved into coffins beneath the school, then, are not random. They are echoes of ancient rites, rituals designed to contain, to seal, to convert the power of the dead into a tool of control. The people who etched them understood the science of fear, the leverage of silence, the subtle manipulation of memory. These are techniques lost to the textbooks, deliberately erased, yet persistent across time. Even today, these methods thrive. Corporate campuses rise over old burial grounds. Government buildings occupy land with violent histories. Schools, libraries, hospitals, anywhere life flows, the dead are often buried beneath, ensuring that history, trauma, and lessons remain hidden from view. It is quiet, invisible, and horrifyingly effective. And here is what most fail to grasp: this is not superstition. This is strategy. Power codifies itself in space, architecture, and ritual. The placement of structures above bones is both symbolic and functional. It transmits a lesson to the living without uttering a single word. Forget what you should not know. Obey what you are told. Respect authority without question. The schoolyard, laughing children, the cheerful bells, they are all part of this pattern. Each generation conditioned to walk over the dead, to absorb obedience through exposure, to inherit silence as if it were natural. Once you understand the depth of this system, the gravity of the school beneath the graveyard becomes clear. It is not a single act of erasure. It is centuries of deliberate, orchestrated manipulation, one that continues to shape us today. The dead beneath that schoolyard are not silent. They speak in ways most cannot perceive, and their voices are not ghostly. They are psychological, physiological, embedded in the fabric of the living. Every generation that played on that ground carried echoes of suffering. Children who were restless, inexplicably anxious, or prone to nightmares were not imagining it. They were breathing in the weight of trauma buried beneath their feet. Every shuffle of shoes, every footstep across the playground transmitted history into their nervous systems. The dead do not need mouths to speak. They leave impressions in the mind, subtle reminders of injustice. Consider the teachers, the parents, the administrators. Even they were affected, though unaware. Decisions were influenced by unease, by tension that they could not name. Communities raised atop erased graveyards often experience patterns of distrust, social fragmentation, and obedience. It is as if the buried imparted their story silently, shaping behavior without consent. This is power in its most insidious form. No visible chains, no overt threats. Yet control is absolute. People do not rebel because the imprint of history, suppressed, buried, invisible, conditions them to accept authority and conformity. The children above are trained not to see, not to question, and in doing so, the buried ensure the continuation of silence, and the symbols carved into the coffins amplify this effect. They are psychological anchors, ancient techniques encoded into wood, soil, and stone, designed to contain energy, to bind memory, and to influence the living above. You may think it is superstition, but science tells us that environments shape the mind, and trauma can be inherited across generations. The schoolyard was a silent classroom in obedience, its lesson written in the soil itself. This is where the real horror lies. It is invisible, pervasive, and persistent. Those who were buried did not leave willingly. Their pain was transformed into a tool for control, affecting the living in ways that textbooks cannot describe and most adults never comprehend. And now, having learned this, you begin to notice the subtle unease wherever authority asserts itself. That tension, that discomfort, is inherited knowledge, the imprint of the forgotten. The dead are speaking. And now, so are you, if you dare to listen. It is time to speak directly to you. You are no longer a passive observer. You are part of this story now, because awareness is not neutral. Once you know, once you see, you cannot return. I want you to pause for a moment. Take in what you have learned. The children buried beneath the school, the symbols carved into coffins, the institutions that covered it all with smiles and lessons. And feel the weight, feel the pressure of the forgotten pressing against the living. Now, I want you to repeat a phrase silently, and if you feel compelled, write it in the comments. I see what was hidden. Do it twice. Let it resonate. Because symbols, words, and acknowledgement are all tools of transformation. By repeating this phrase, you are claiming awareness. You are declaring that you will not forget, that the weight of the hidden will no longer pass unnoticed. This is more than ritual. It is a cognitive key. By acknowledging the unseen, you shift your perspective. You train your mind to notice patterns, to question narratives, to perceive power as it truly operates. You are no longer blind. You are awake. And understand this, awakening is dangerous. Institutions, systems, those who benefit from silence, they do not want people to repeat that phrase. They fear recognition. They fear awareness. Because once enough people see, the control begins to erode. But you are not done yet. Awareness alone is only the first step. Now comes understanding. You must see the pattern of concealment and manipulation that stretches from the past beneath that school to the present in every system you interact with. From education to governance, from architecture to ritual, the principle is the same. Shape perception, control memory, and wield silence as power. By saying, I see what was hidden, you are not just affirming knowledge. You are engaging with it. You are placing yourself within the lineage of those who refuse to forget. You are aligning your consciousness with the weight of the forgotten and allowing it to illuminate the unseen forces shaping your world. Repeat it, write it, feel it, and understand. This is where the journey deepens. Among the countless children who walked above that graveyard, some carried memories they could not explain. Small voices whispered in the night, nightmares that replayed events they never witnessed, anxiety that clung to them like a shadow, and parents, puzzled, dismissed it as imagination. But imagination does not leave bruises on the soul. One boy, barely 10, would wake screaming, describing hands reaching through the floorboards, fingers cold and brittle. He drew them on paper, figures emerging from the earth, silent yet demanding attention. Teachers told him to stop. His drawings were confiscated. But the fear did not vanish. It lingered, lodged deep in his mind, shaping his world, his trust, his perception. A girl in the same school reported voices in the cafeteria, whispering names no one knew, names that did not appear in any registry. She would speak them aloud, and those around her would shiver, though they could not explain why. By adolescence, her instinct was to conform, to obey, to stay silent. The trauma of the buried had seeped into her consciousness, shaping behavior without explanation. Even adults were affected. Teachers, administrators, janitors all reported unease that could not be rationalized. Doors would slam with no wind. Steps echoed in empty halls. The subtle imprint of hundreds of forgotten lives pressed against their awareness, altering decisions, moods, and relationships. This is the true power of buried history. It manipulates not through force, but through subtle influence. It teaches compliance by embedding itself in subconscious memory. Those above the graves learned obedience in ways the textbooks could never explain. And here is what most will never understand. The children above those graves did not just inherit trauma, they inherited a system of control encoded in architecture, ritual, and silence. Their suffering was transformed into obedience, their unease into compliance. When you hear this, it should resonate. You are living in a world built on similar principles. The invisible dead-shaped behavior, the forgotten dictate perception, the silenced influence decisions. And if you have felt inexplicable fear, anxiety, or pressure in your own life, know this: you may have already walked across similar graveyards, inherited patterns of control, absorbed weight not of your own making. The dead are speaking whether you hear them or not. Normalization is the quietest weapon of control. It does not scream, it does not threaten. It whispers, slowly convincing the living that horrors are ordinary, that injustice is routine, that silence is acceptable. In the case of the graveyard beneath the school, normalization began the moment the first brick was laid over those bones. Children learned to laugh where death lingered. Lessons were taught above coffins, bells rang, and life carried on as if nothing had happened. Playgrounds became sacred camouflage, cheerful colors masking centuries of forgotten suffering. Adults participated unwittingly. Teachers focused on grades, administrators on policies, parents on schedules. Every person who accepted the surface as normal reinforced the cover-up. No one asked, no one remembered. The dead remained silent because the living agreed by their inattention to forget. Normalization is a psychological masterstroke. By making the horrific mundane, it removes moral urgency. The buried children beneath the school became invisible, not because of distance, but because of habit. The society above learned to ignore injustice, to accept control, to internalize obedience. And this pattern repeats across institutions. Historical atrocities are sanitized in textbooks. Brutal practices are reframed as tradition or progress. The system trains people to overlook what they should condemn. Generations inherit not only structures but attitudes, behaviors, and silent complicity. This is why the graveyard matters beyond its physical presence. Its bones are not the only legacy. The way it was hidden, the way life above it proceeded as normal, created a model for control. When children grow up thinking silence is safe, when communities are conditioned to accept forgetting, authority is never questioned. Here is the key insight. Normalization does not merely hide the past, it prepares the future. By embedding obedience and ignorance in everyday life, institutions shape minds for decades, ensuring that the same patterns of silence and compliance repeat endlessly. And now, knowing this, you can see the subtle mechanisms everywhere, in classrooms, workplaces, government agencies, even social groups. The patterns are not random, they are intentional, they are centuries in the making, and they only survive because the living accept them without question. The dead beneath the school were silenced once. The living have been trained to maintain that silence, and together they perpetuate a cycle of control that few even recognize. Symbols are not decoration. Rituals are not entertainment. Both are instruments of power, tools designed to encode obedience and silence across generations. The coffins beneath the school carried symbols for a reason, but the influence did not stop there. Look closely at the architecture above. Spirals in the flooring, arches that bend unnaturally, crosses misaligned, lines etched into woodwork, all echoes of the symbols carved into the graves. These were not mistakes or coincidences. They were deliberate reinforcements, a language of control designed to interact with human perception without conscious awareness. Ritual embeds memory into the subconscious. By repeatedly walking over spaces infused with these designs, children and adults alike absorb patterns of obedience. They learn, without words, what authority demands. They feel the weight of history and instinctively follow the path carved by those who orchestrated it. Even modern society echoes this practice. Hidden symbols in corporate logos, urban planning, and educational institutions serve the same purpose. They silently guide behavior, shape thought, and perpetuate systems of control, all rooted in traditions older than the nation itself. In the graveyard beneath the school, the combination of buried trauma and symbolic reinforcement created a feedback loop. Trauma imprinted obedience. Symbols encoded compliance. Repetition made it habitual. Every generation above those graves became conditioned, subtly but irresistibly, to accept authority and forget the hidden horrors. Understand this: the system does not rely on overt violence. It relies on invisibility, on repetition, on embedding control in the very environment of life. That is the genius and the danger of ritualized power. And now you begin to see it. The children buried, the coffins marked, the school above. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of an ongoing lineage of control that spans centuries. By understanding the rituals, by recognizing the symbols, you begin to decode the silent language of authority. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Awareness becomes your weapon, your responsibility, and your curse. The power encoded in symbols is ancient, but so is the human capacity to resist it once it is understood. The buried dead are not confined to the past. Their influence flows upward, shaping the present in subtle, almost invisible ways. Societies built upon graves inherit patterns that persist for generations, encoded not in law or language, but in behavior, decision-making, and social expectation. Consider obedience as a learned instinct. Children who grew up above that schoolyard were conditioned to accept authority without question. Anxiety, unease, and subconscious recognition of injustice molded compliance into habit. As adults, they carried those lessons into workplaces, homes, and government. Their choices were influenced not by rational thought alone, but by the silent weight of what had been buried beneath their feet. Power thrives on this inheritance. By shaping behavior indirectly, institutions create a cycle of compliance that does not rely on coercion. The living, unknowingly trained by the buried, enforce norms that preserve authority. Fear is subtle, yet effective. Trauma, passed down invisibly, becomes a tool for governance. Look at communities built over erased histories. Citizens accept poverty, inequality, or systemic injustice with a quiet resignation. They normalize silence, suppress dissent, and perpetuate patterns that benefit those at the top. This is not random. It is inherited, learned, and enforced, rooted in centuries of buried truth and orchestrated oblivion. And the school is a microcosm of this system. Its foundations were built over erased lives, its classrooms infused with ritual and symbol, its students conditioned by environment and fear. The result is generations shaped by unseen forces, reproducing obedience, perpetuating silence, and unknowingly guarding the secrets of the past. The lesson is both personal and systemic. The dead shape behavior long after the graves are forgotten. Memory, trauma, and symbolism travel through time, influencing decisions you may not recognize as your own. The unseen past is alive in the present, and its reach is vast, subtle, and persistent. Now, look around you. The structures you inhabit, the rituals you follow, the fears you carry. How much of it is truly yours? And how much is the echo of the forgotten, pressing upward from graves buried beneath the surface of history? Silence is the lifeblood of control. The graveyard beneath the school endured not just because it was buried, but because generations above it refused or were trained not to speak. Complicity is not always active participation. Often it is the quiet acceptance of what one sees but chooses to ignore. Teachers, administrators, and even parents carried fragments of awareness. A strange draft in a classroom, a child's whispered fears, a hidden symbol carved in a floorboard, each instance a clue, yet most dismissed, rationalized, or forgot. This is the insidious nature of complicity. It hides behind good intentions, normal routines, and fear of consequences. And complicit silence is contagious. Children inherit it from adults, societies normalize it across institutions, and the cycle repeats. Obedience, compliance, and the erasure of uncomfortable truths become habits, not because people are inherently passive, but because the system rewards ignoring what lies beneath. But awareness changes everything. Once you see the pattern, the silence becomes uncomfortable. The structures of obedience, built over centuries, begin to crack. The weight of the forgotten presses upward, demanding acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is the first act of rebellion. By repeating, "I see what was hidden," you are breaking the silence. You are refusing complicity. You are awakening to the mechanisms that shape behavior, decisions, and perception without consent. This is dangerous knowledge not because it threatens institutions directly, but because it threatens the comfort of compliance. Complicity thrives in comfort. Awareness thrives in discomfort. And now, as you hear this, you are stepping into discomfort. You are beginning to see the dead beneath the school, the symbols, the rituals, and the patterns of power they enforce. You are joining the lineage of those who refuse to forget. A cycle of silence is centuries old, but it can be disrupted, and disruption begins with observation, acknowledgement, and refusal to accept the normalized erasure of history. You are no longer outside the system. You are inside it, aware of its construction and capable of noticing its hidden levers of control. Knowledge of the buried is not just information, it is transformation. Once you see what was hidden, your perception of the world shifts. You begin to notice patterns others overlook, recognize influence others accept, and perceive control others unconsciously obey. Awareness becomes a lens, a tool, and a weapon. This transformation is not comfortable, it is heavy, it carries responsibility. Once you know the truth of the graveyard beneath the school, the erasure, the symbols, the rituals, you cannot pretend ignorance. Your decisions, your behavior, your interpretation of authority are forever altered. You begin to question, to resist, to seek clarity where others accept the surface. The power of awareness lies in its subtlety. You do not immediately change institutions or rewrite history, you change yourself, and the self is the foundation of influence. By understanding how silence, ritual, and symbolism shape obedience, you learn to recognize the mechanisms at play in everyday life, from schools to workplaces, from governments to social structures. Awareness grants agency. You start noticing manipulation where others comply blindly. You see patterns of conformity, fear, and inherited trauma, and you choose to respond differently. You do not have to act recklessly. You act strategically, informed by centuries of hidden knowledge encoded in space, behavior, and ritual. But remember this, knowledge is dangerous. It attracts scrutiny from those invested in maintaining silence. It challenges comfort, routine, and the illusions of authority. And it isolates you, at least initially, from those who have not awakened. That is part of the cost, but it is also part of the power. Once you integrate awareness, you become a conduit between past and present. You honor the forgotten, interpret the symbols, and perceive the cycles of control. You begin to operate with insight that most never achieve. The graveyard beneath the school, once hidden, now teaches not just horror but mastery of perception, of self, and of the structures that govern life. And this is where transformation begins, in seeing what was hidden, refusing complicity, and choosing awareness over comfort. You are no longer merely a witness. You are now a participant in understanding, resisting, and decoding power itself. The schoolyard is not unique. The buried, the erased, the silenced, these patterns repeat across the world. Every continent has its hidden histories, every civilization its forgotten graves, every institution its methods of shaping obedience through erasure. The principles are universal, the tools are consistent. In Europe, mass graves beneath city streets were paved over to facilitate commerce and authority, their stories lost to bureaucracy and convenience. In Asia, sacred burial sites were repurposed for administrative buildings or military encampments, enforcing conformity while erasing history. In the Americas, indigenous burial grounds were often obliterated to make way for schools, settlements, and plantations, embedding trauma into generations who had no voice. Notice the pattern. Bury the past, build the present, normalize the surface, and manipulate perception. The same cycle, the same ritual, the same method of control, and it works because the living inherit the consequences invisibly. They follow patterns of obedience established by trauma they never witnessed. They internalize lessons written in soil, stone, and ritual. Symbols accompany these practices everywhere. Crooked crosses, spirals, circles, and lines appear in architecture, insignias, and even corporate logos. They are subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they influence behavior, perception, and decision-making. They are markers of power, embedded into the very spaces where life unfolds, repeating the lessons of the buried for those who walk above. This is why local stories, like the graveyard beneath the school, matter. They are microcosms of a global strategy. By understanding one site, you begin to recognize the method everywhere. The dead may be silent, but their impact is amplified by repetition across societies, cultures, and centuries. And here is the critical insight. Control does not need enforcement when history is buried. When memory is erased, obedience is inherited. When trauma is encoded into environment and ritual, compliance becomes instinct. And awareness, your awareness, is the first crack in a system designed to perpetuate itself indefinitely. The world is littered with hidden graves, unseen symbols, and silent mechanisms of control. And now, having learned this, you cannot ignore them. You begin to see the invisible threads connecting seemingly isolated events to a global web of manipulation, power, and obedience. Awareness is not without consequence. Those who see what was hidden do not return to innocence. They carry knowledge that isolates them, that challenges their relationships, and forces them to navigate a world still largely blind to the truth. The awakened feel unease where others feel comfort. They notice patterns of manipulation that others accept without question. Subtle control, inherited trauma, and the invisible influence of the past become impossible to ignore. It is both gift and burden, a lens that illuminates but also casts shadows over everyday life. Some experience anger, frustration, or despair. The knowledge of centuries-long manipulation, hidden atrocities, and systematic erasure can weigh heavily. Others feel a sense of responsibility, compelled to act, to inform, or to resist. But action is fraught. Challenging deeply ingrained systems provokes resistance, hostility, and even attempts at silencing. Isolation is common. Friends, colleagues, and family may dismiss or ridicule the awareness you carry. You become an observer of patterns they cannot perceive, a witness to histories they have forgotten or been taught to ignore. This is why few awaken fully. The cost is social, emotional, and sometimes physical. Yet this awakening is transformative. Those who persist gain clarity, insight, and agency. They begin to see the machinery of power for what it is, systems built on obedience, silence, and manipulation. They recognize when history is being buried or rewritten, and when authority is being accepted blindly. Their perception becomes a tool, allowing them to operate in ways inaccessible to the unawakened. And here is the most important point. Knowledge empowers, but it also demands responsibility. To see what was hidden is not passive, it is active. Every choice, every observation, every refusal to accept normalized control contributes to breaking the cycle. Your awareness becomes part of a lineage of those who refused complicity, who honored the forgotten, and who transformed understanding into action. You have inherited this vision. The dead beneath the school, the symbols, the erased history. They have chosen you as witness. And how you carry that knowledge defines whether it remains dormant or becomes a force for transformation, insight, and subtle resistance in a world still largely blind. The children beneath the school were never meant to be forgotten, yet history demanded it. Their lives, their deaths, their presence beneath the foundation of education were silenced, but not erased. Their trauma became a conduit of control, their silence a lesson in obedience. What they teach is subtle but undeniable. The past shapes the present in ways that cannot be rationalized away. Every decision, every instinct, every act of conformity carries echoes of those erased. The lessons they were forced to leave behind are embedded in space, ritual and symbol, waiting for those who dare to perceive. These truths are psychologically haunting because they reveal the mechanisms of power at their most intimate. Control is not always exercised through force. It thrives in subtlety, in invisibility, in the careful orchestration of what people see, hear, and are trained to ignore. The dead are never silent. They speak through influence, shaping behavior, perception, and consciousness. And here is the terrifying realization. The world above is complicit, even unknowingly. Generations conditioned to accept silence, normalized to overlook injustice, reproduce obedience without ever understanding why. Every playground, school, office, and city built over the bones of the past continues the same cycle. But the awakening is powerful. Those who see, those who understand, inherit the responsibility to perceive, to analyze, and to resist. Knowledge becomes armor, awareness becomes agency, and memory becomes a weapon against the perpetuation of control. By acknowledging what was buried, you disrupt patterns that centuries of silence sought to enforce. The final lesson is this: the dead beneath the school are not victims. They are teachers. Their presence demands vigilance. Their silence teaches insight. Their buried lives illuminate the structures of authority, obedience, and rituals that shape the world you inhabit. You now carry their message. You have seen what was hidden. You have felt the weight of inherited trauma and the subtle influence of obedience. And in this knowledge lies both danger and power, the ability to see beyond the surface, to recognize manipulation, and to step into the world awake, aware, and forever changed. You have walked with me through silence, through shadows, through the forgotten soil beneath a school where the dead were hidden to preserve the illusion of order. What began as a story of bones has unfolded into a revelation about power itself, how it buries truth, how it rewrites memory, and how it conditions obedience through silence. Now the choice rests with you. Awareness is a threshold. You cannot unsee what you have seen, cannot unhear what you have heard. The buried children are no longer voiceless, for you have carried their silence into your own consciousness. Their graves are not only beneath a school, they are beneath every institution that thrives on erasure, every system that demands conformity, every ritual that hides its origins. The truth is simple yet devastating. Nothing built on silence remains innocent, and everything built on erased lives demands to be questioned. You now possess that lens, that sharpened vision. The only question left is, what will you do with it? Will you retreat into the comfort of forgetting, or will you carry this awareness as armor, as weapon, as awakening? Remember the phrase we spoke earlier. Write it again. Seal it into your mind. Let it become a reminder of identity, of vision, of refusal to be complicit. The algorithm will register your words, but deeper than that, it will mark your transformation. You are no longer an observer. You are initiated. When the school bell rings, when the children laugh, when life continues above ground as if nothing ever happened, you will know, and that knowing is everything. It is what separates the living who sleep from the living who see. This is where the descent ends, but it is also where the journey begins. You are now among the few who carry the forbidden knowledge, the awareness that graves lie beneath our foundations, that silence is never empty, and that power always hides its rose. What's in the soil of the forgotten? Carry this truth carefully, speak it wisely, and remember, once you awaken, you cannot return.